So what I want to present here today is the mistake I've made in real life on a real project, ignoring some parts of the architecture and how it cost me a lot of time of refactoring and repairing it. And to make this point, I'm just going to briefly introduce the architecture I was using. I'm not going to go in depth, but the main point is that I made a mistake. It cost me a lot of time, and I'm going to show you how I fixed it and what you should do, why you shouldn't be like me, the way I was back then. So let's start with the architecture. This is a high-level overview of the architecture I was using. And it's divided in 3 big layers. The first one of them is source or data layer. And it's a layer that contains all the communication with the sources of data. So it can be an API, it can be a database or some files or some shared preferences or anything. So it only does the communication with the data source. And it exposes that data to the domain. And now in the domain, we do kind of mapping stuff, and we are providing actually a tunnel between data and the UI layer. But in the domain, we are mapping stuff into domain objects because we don't want to expose data objects to the UI because they have unnecessary data about maybe some details about the API call or maybe something about the entity in the database. So we do this that we call anti-corruption layer, and we map the stuff to the domain. To do this, we have like 3 sub-layers. We do interactors. They communicate with the data layer, and they fetch some object. But that object is still in the form of a data object. So let me start from the beginning here. Let's suppose that I have an API service, and I have some API call to fetch profile. It has a profile response, and then I will wrap that API service into a source to hide the details of the API. So I will only use the source class to communicate with the domain layer. And then next, I'm going to use interactor to communicate with that source. And the interactor is actually the last class that still deals with the data objects, so profile response. And at this point, I would want to map it into something else, into a domain, because, as I said, I don't want to mix the two. I want to use domain object in my UI, because my business logic is built around the domain. So I create a class called mapper. And then I'm going to map the data object, so response, into a domain object, which I called profile. Next, and this is still the domain layer, we have repository, and the repository is a class that actually uses all these things. So it actually injects the interactor and the mapper and exposes a profile in some function. And it returns a domain object. As you can see, it doesn't deal with data objects anymore, but it still has to fetch it. So in this fetch profile function, you can see that I'm using the interactor to fetch profile, and this response will actually be a data object. So it will be a profile response. But after I deal with it with the mapper, it's going to be a domain object. So from repository on, no more data objects, only domain. And then to top it all off, and to make sure that the UI only gets domain objects, we make use cases. And use case actually uses the repository function to give me the domain object that I need. And you might want to ask me here, why did I make a use case when I can just use repository? It returns the domain object anyway. I just made another class just to fetch one thing. Well, the answer to this question is very complicated, but basically the use case is completely free of any data information. So repository still knows about profile response because it uses it in the fetch profile method, but the use case is completely free. And also I can use use case to do some additional stuff like storing the profile in cache or something if I wanted to. So to get to the common concerns of developers when making such architecture, which I've personally said and heard some other people say it, is like, I just need to fetch this one class, and why do I need to make like 7 classes just to do that? Well, sometimes it seems unreasonable, but it pays off, and you're just gonna have to trust me on that, because to explain why it pays off, it would take 2 hours. And then some other worries that you might have is you will have a tight deadline, or maybe your data objects would be exactly the same as the domain object. Then you would want to reuse the data object. But this is never good, because data objects, even if they're exactly the same, they're always going to have some detail, at least an annotation about the API call or the database entry or anything that you wouldn't need in the UI layer. So even if they're exactly the same, you should make separate domain. And now, when we have a separate domain, it's much easier to implement domain logic and separately from your API sources or any kinds of sources. You just need to worry about those classes. You can make all your logic, and they do not depend on where you get your data from. OK, so this is an overview. Let's get to the real example that I had. So I'm working on a coffee app. So my app is supposed to connect to a coffee machine with Bluetooth, and then you can brew coffee by selecting the coffee you want and pressing the brew button. And then, while I was working, the client came. So app is in a very early stage. It's still being built from the bottom up. And one day, client said, OK, we want to do brewing now. We will send you an API drink. A drink will have a recipe. And we want you to convert that recipe into protobuf, because our machine works with protobuf, and then convert this protobuf into a byte array and send it over MQTT. And MQTT is just a protocol to send to communicate over Wi-Fi with like IoT protocol. So that's what I did. So I received a drink. I received a really complex recipe object, because the machine has a lot of different options, and the recipe object can be really huge. And it has a lot of steps and stuff. So OK, I said, say no more. And I did all the work. So I converted the API model from drink into a domain object drink. But while I was doing that, I was considering to do a domain object for recipe as well. But I chose not to do that, because the machine only needs the byte array that I generate from the protobuf to brew something. So I decided to skip domain model of recipe, because it would be a lot of work. It's a huge model. And I just decided to just convert it to byte array straight away. So go through all of the steps, API model to protobuf, and then to byte array. And I did that. And then my domain model looked something like this. And I hope you can read this. I hope it's not too small. But as you can see here, the last variable in this abstract drink class is a recipe. And it's a byte array. And that's what I did. So this is my domain object, drink. I work with that object in the application. And I use this byte array to brew the coffee when brew button is pressed. And this is generally my workflow, how I did it. So API, drink resource, so data object, converted with mapper to byte array. And the rest of the drink, name, size, but that's simple. So I did it faster. OK, so brewing works, and everything seems perfect. But, and there's a big but. Client came again. I didn't mean buts, like both, like behind. Nobody has a big butt here. OK. So the client came again. It was 2 weeks later. I was still happy about brewing, because it was really complex to implement. And the client said, OK, now we have brewing. But now we want to modify the recipes inside the app. So we have a different screen where you can take some drink and you can change the temperature, you can change the volume, and you can do anything you like with that. So I said, OK, I guess shouldn't be that hard. And then I look at my class again, and I see this recipe byte array. And what do you think was my problem? You cannot modify a serialized byte array generated from protobuf, generated from API, to just change the temperature, because it's all in code, and I don't understand a thing from that byte array. I cannot change a thing there. So this is now a problem to me. And this is my face on that day. Yeah, and by the way, I estimated the feature to like 20 hours, because it should have been a simple screen with some sliders for temperature. So I gave estimation for 20 hours. And the questions actually that I asked here, how do you edit this? The answer to this question is you don't. So I was wrong from the start. I did it wrongly. So how did I fix it? Well, my next step was a really long session of brainstorming, and it took like at least one whole day, maybe more. And this is what I came up with. So instead of the short workflow that I had, now I have to fetch the drink from the API, then do multiple mappers to convert drinks and recipes into separate domain models. Even though recipe is really complex, I need to separate it, make a separate mapper for that. And then another mapper. Actually, I can now use the domain object from the recipe to edit the temperature and volume. So I have achieved one thing. And now that I can edit it, I need a separate mapper to just create a protobuf from that new recipe that I made. So it's no longer API to protobuf, it's now domain to protobuf. And domain is way different. So actually, I needed to change a whole bunch of screens in the application, because I worked with just byte array, and now I had a whole new domain model that needed to be adjusted for all of the screens that use any kind of drinks. And now that I have another mapper, I can convert the domain object into protobuf and into byte array and send it to machine. And it works, no problem. And my new domain object for a drink here has brew recipe instead of byte array. That's just a new class that I made for the domain object. And for legal reasons, I can't show you the contents of that class. So sorry about that. But I hope it's clear enough. So, and it worked, and all was good. But I estimated the feature to 20 hours, and I spent 50 or even more. I think I spent more. I needed to refactor the whole domain. I needed to skip the mapper that does from API to byte array and insert two new layers, domain and protobuf, and then byte array. I needed to adjust behavior of at least 3 or 4 other screens because of the new model. And then after all of that, I needed to implement the feature itself, because even though it was not that complex, it still took like some hours to make the sliders and the design. And what were the consequences of this whole adventure that I had? Well, I was late on delivering the screen. iOS guy was way ahead of me, and I hated him. Modifications took way more than I thought, and the most actually impactful thing that was happening to me, I was really stressed. Not just in those couple of days, but I was really stressed for a whole month, because I was always behind, like 2 steps behind. Because I was late with this feature, I was late with the next one and the next one, and it took me a month to catch up. So it was a really stressful month for me. And then what is the total cost of this whole adventure? Well, initially I saved like 4 or 5 hours, because I just skipped one domain model, and I made whole architecture that I explained earlier to work with the way I made it, with the byte array. And then in the end, it cost me 3 days of work and 30 days of stress. And the conclusion here is, don't be lazy, like me. Like I was, I'm not lazy anymore, I learned my lesson. Don't be lazy about architecture. And I'm serious about this. It's hard to prove, but I hope you trust me, because initially it will cost you a lot of time. You will spend a lot of time just setting up all the classes, all the base classes, the interactor, the mapper, the layers. But after you make all of that, and the iOS guy is already 5 days ahead of you, your app will be maintainable. Your use cases will be reusable. You can just inject them somewhere else, and the iOS guy will have to go all over again. So, well, I hope this was not just a lesson learned for me, but for some of you too, and that's all. Do you have any questions?